What's going on, guys? It's Charr here, back with another video, and today we're going to be aiming to make you a multiplayer pro. Let's get to it. Okay, so we're going to be talking about multiplayer today. We're going to do a couple of disclaimers and introductions here. If you just want to get into the video proper on how to get into multiplayer, how to deck build, multiplayer considerations, solo caveats and restrictions and whatnot, feel free to stick around. But I always want to start these videos off with the disclaimer here. I'm going to express some opinions on what I think about multiplayer deck building, how you should operate and play multiplayer games, and the biggest disclaimer I want to say is that I've never truly had a bad experience playing multiplayer in this game, and I would say probably a lot of people don't play the game or think about the game like I do. These are simply recommendations from my own experience that I find to make multiplayer games more fun, make multiplayer games flow better, and make your decks more better at the goal they're trying to accomplish. Really roundabout way of saying that. I don't mean to offend or like try and call anyone out here. This is not for any specific instance that happened to me or anything like that. These are just general recommendations to have a good time for multiplayer. And as you can probably tell, this is video is inspired because the Con of Heroes is coming up in under a week away. I wanted to do some sort of like lead into like the road to Con of Heroes type of videos on my channel, but I didn't really know how to do that other than just making a bunch of like deck doctors about the decks I was going to bring. If you guys are interested on any of the heroes that I'm bringing, I have a couple that I'll probably name in the video later. Make sure to let me know in the description below. Maybe we get a deck doctor on one or two of them. But in general, yes, this is for the Con of Heroes. It's kind of like a Con of Heroes prep video. You can think of it in that way, but it's not going to be titled that. We're going to be talking about deck building, and let's get into it. So for the very astute of you, you may have noticed that this is kind of like a response to my own video I made like a year ago from this date, where I tried to learn multiplayer deck building in a week. This was before I went to the Con of Heroes for the first time, and I would say I really pivoted into primarily playing multiplayer from being a solo channel. And I learned a lot in my experience going to Con. I learned a lot in this week leading up, trying to learn how to make multiplayer decks in, anticipation of the Con. And this is kind of like a response video that I think I got some things right, I think I got some things wrong, but we're generally going to be going over the same kind of cadence. We're going to be talking about the pitfalls of making decks for solo, kind of pitfalls of making decks for multiplayer, and also advice in general for playing multiplayer games, building multiplayer decks, and everything in between. So as you can see, it's probably an homage here. We probably have a Shuri doing something very similar with this thumbnail. Wanted to throw that in there before getting into it proper. Now, we're going to start on Marvel Card Database, where basically all the best things happen. You can find a ton of resources on decks and whatnot, but this is where we're going to start the scene. And we're going to talk about making decks for solo, kind of the pitfalls of solo decks, and how you can use some of the lessons to solos to get you into multiplayer deck building. So I don't want to like pick like any of one of these great creators on here and try and like dissect and show why a deck list is bad when taking a solo deck to multiplayer. So instead of doing that, I will dissect one of my own decks that I made for Marvel Rewind. This is a Cable deck, and this is talking about Strife. So I wanted to talk about some specific solo pitfalls you will find when you make decks in multiplayer when you make decks in solo compared to multiplayer. So the biggest thing I find in solo is that you, in most scenarios and in most things, you're not looking for immediate tempo. Unless you're specifically fighting a Ronin, unless you're explicitly fighting a Nebula or something. In solo, you want to amass a big resource advantage against the villain and use that to advance the game state over a course of turns. In general, I find that solo games tend to run a bit longer than multiplayer games. You will find you very rarely go through like a second deck pass in multiplayer unless there's kind of, I would say, something going wrong in quotations at the table. But I find that in solo, sometimes I would get like usually one minimum, but sometimes two or even three deck passes, which is just not something that really happens in multiplayer. It may have just been me as a player, or maybe the scenarios I was playing was too easy, but I don't know. I think playing expert in solo is a hard enough challenge in general. So one thing you're going to find, an example of you're looking to get ahead and build instead of playing cards for tempo, and you look at a deck list like this, what is an example of some cards in this deck that fit that bill? So I think Professor X and Nick Fury are two huge things that show that, that idea that you're looking to build. Nick Fury basically gets a hand that is unplayable and gets you into new cards. He also does big amounts of thwarting in a solo perspective. Being able to thwart for 2 basically keeps the main in check for 2 whole turns in solo, and he provides you a block, so he gives you card draw to set up more. He gives you attack, and he gives you damage or thwart, and he gives you survivability, which is super strong. Professor X is strong in a similar way, where he provides you either a ready if you're an X-Men or a confuse on the villain, which lets you flip down, which is usually locked out in solo mode. And then he also gives you a block and a ton of thwarting, again answering a ton of problems in solo just by himself. He like clears a side scheme on his own, or he keeps the main in check. And so when you have these really strong allies that answer a ton of problems for you, like playing a Professor X is all the thwarting you need, and also gives you a chance to go down. Nick Fury gives you cards to build, and also survivability, and also is a bit of thwart. It means that you are kind of incentivized to play allies because they solve all your problems in solo. That being said, I don't necessarily think that's the case in multiplayer. When you're in multiplayer, because of the influx of encounter cards, you're going to see a lot more minions, you're going to see a lot more side schemes, and the biggest thing is side schemes get really big in multiplayer. When you're thinking of 3 to 4 players, a side scheme doesn't come in with 3 threat, it comes in with 9 and even 12 threat. So if you're sitting down at a table and everyone is bringing a solo deck where they don't have specified answers for like thwarting side schemes or dealing with minions effectively, and everyone's turn just kind of looks like, well, I'm going to like play a Nick Fury and deal 2 damage and then like play an upgrade and then that's it, right? Or then the next person's like, well, I'm going to play Professor X and Confuse, and he's going to thwart for 3 out of 12 threat on the side scheme, and I'm going to thwart for 2 more, and I'm going to go down. And then it's like the next person plays Professor X and the next person plays Nick Fury. Obviously, you couldn't do this because of the unique rule, but in a situation when you make decks like these where allies are so strong, these allies are not actually, their stats are not high enough, they don't scale enough in multiplayer to actually answer these problems. So you'll find that in general, a lot of solo decks have a ton of allies in them, and when you look in general for multiplayer decks, a lot of them don't have as many allies. That being said, if you're playing a hero on the weaker side who needs some help surviving, playing allies is still a good thing because you're fixing an issue in your deck, which is your survivability. But I would say for something like Cable here, right, and this is something that we might go into at the end when I would change this deck from a solo perspective to multiplayer, that I probably wouldn't play like half of these allies. I don't really need like the Daredevil or the Jessica Jones. I don't really need the Monica Chang and the surveillance teams and stuff like that. Like these things aren't like super required in a multiplayer because, again, this is my opinion here, I find that you can be more specialized. Another example of how solo is looking to build and build fast, you can play these cards that are pretty inefficient unless they hit their kickers, and when you hit the kicker, it makes them super efficient. This is an example of a card I think is basically just solo only. I can't see you, maybe you find a use for this in 2-player, but getting past 3, unless you're playing someone with like turbo thwarting like a Miss Marvel or Jubilee, I can't see you ever playing this card. That being said, it is such a big difference viewing this card in solo because this card answers all your problems. You're almost always keeping the threat on the main in check, so you just play for 1 resource and this basically cycles a card in your hand. You can use it to clear a side scheme and double diff on a skilled investigator, so you clear that side scheme and now you're drawing like 2 cards off of it and things like that. This is a card that you will almost never see in multiplayer, and it's something I implore you to look into kind of decks. Look into and get inspired by other people's decks on Marvel CDB who are known players who play multiplayer, or maybe who are, you know, given their write-up specific instructions or like suggestions for playing in 1 to 2 player versus 3 to 4 that give you those kind of card swaps, because they will give you ideas on how you should be thinking and building decks for multiplayer. That's not to discourage you from trying to deck build on your own. The problem is deck building on your own without proper testing can lead into some scenarios that may be unfavorable for you at a table. You may feel like you're not doing enough output, you may feel like your turns are kind of lackluster, and everything in between. Essentially, that's what I wanted to say in terms of my solo kind of pitfalls. In solo, you're looking for a lot of things to build out, right? So you have like these kind of really clear the area helps you build out. You got this Nick Fury that helps you build out because it gives you survivability and answers all your problems. You know, we have a couple things in here like you know, Def Focus is probably a card you play in Cable anyways, and that being said, I also made this deck with a multiplayer mindset in general. It's not one of my first ones in Marvel Rewind where it was only solo focused, so there may be a bit of kind of bias in how I make decks and whatnot here. But in general, this is not a deck that I would bring into multiplayer as is. Could it function and could it work? Sure, it could. But if Cable's trying to take out his side schemes in solo, I mean, 3 threat is nothing, right? We can just clear the areas. You can play any of these allies to help us out. He exhausts to thwart, he readies up, and then he thwarts off the main, and that's it. That's all your thwarting you need. But when you're going into a multiplayer game, and now those side schemes have 12 threat, and all the ones from the encounter deck have 12 threat, it becomes a lot different and a lot scarier for sure. Another thing that I think can be a pitfall for solo decks in general is that because the games are usually longer, there's only one person you need to worry about, and it's kind of like really simple, right? You have a villain you have 7 in the villain phase, you have the activation, and you have an encounter card. You don't really need to worry about kind of playing the slow build out game, right? Like you can build out to this combo of like a Gunboat Diplomacy or one of these other like really fun and cool cards. It's like, okay, if I build up for like 3 or 4 turns, then I get to do like 8 damage and 8 thwarting. The problem is that when you go into a game of multiplayer and it takes that same amount of time, if you can't find the output, and again, I think this is moving into the next section a little bit, if you can't find the output in the turns leading up to that 8 damage and 8 thwart, it doesn't feel as impactful. It doesn't feel as good, right? You want to be spending your turns getting, that's not to discourage you from playing like kind of Johnny or combo decks or decks that need a couple moving pieces to work. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that it should be a version of your deck, and your deck should be able to pivot to other versions. But again, I think this is more so getting into the next thing. So going on to the next thing, I want to talk about multiplayer advice, and I want to shout out something that I was doing in the last video here. So if we go to the Marvel CDB homepage and we click this cards button right here, it's going to take a while to load, but this is going to be your best friend in terms of searching cards you think might be fun to build around, heroes that might be cool to build around, and everything in between for multiplayer. If you go into this text field, you can do under and then friendly. So the thing is, when you search those two, it'll bring up these 2 lists of cards, and essentially these are the cards that I'd say kind of open up or get new kind of opportunities in a multiplayer game compared to a solo game. An example is when you look at something like Now I'm Mad, it says play under any player's control, max 1 per player. So for example, in solo, this first line of text doesn't really matter because you're the only player. But now this opens up opportunities to give upgrades out of aspect to players who are playing different characters. Maybe you have like a She-Hulk player who's playing leadership and you're an aggression player and you're like, well, I'm not really making good use out of Now I'm Mad. Maybe I play this on the She-Hulk player because they're always under half HP, and now they have a base of 4 attack, which would have been basically impossible in leadership outside of like clearing a specialized training. So this is just something that could be really interesting to build around if you are going to the con with somebody, or you want to make like a matching deck with somebody who is showing up at the convention, because there's just like really cool combos. The honoraries are like a really good shout out for cool combos you can do. You can give someone like an honorary X-Men, honorary Avenger, Guardian. Honorary Avenger lets them play something like Avenge Me from their hand on their own allies. So there are definitely some like really cool things you can do. We have things like a telekinetic shield, right? These are really cool. Like we have a Cable card example here, which is, you know, in solo this is a good card, right? It's like you pay it for 2 and you can block any amount of damage. But if you read it in a multiplayer perspective, when a friendly character would take any amount of damage, that is not just you, that's not just an ally, that is anybody at the table. This is essentially a get out of jail free card for a hit as however big it is. It's just a get out of jail free card. Magic Shield is another example of this. It's very similar. When the friendly character would take any amount of damage, discard Magic Shield, prevent 3 of that damage. That's not just Scarlet Witch. That's not just Scarlet Witch's allies and characters. That is everyone at the table in a multiplayer game. These type of cards and interactions are very powerful and can give you really a lot of deck building basis and ideas on what you want to build around and the heroes you want to bring and cool combos you want to try out going from a solo to a multiplayer perspective. Another thing I want to talk about, so yeah, we're looking for these kind of like underneath cards and these friendly cards. This is a good shout out. And another thing I want to shout out is probably like the best example of this, which I think is Skilled Investigator for sure. This isn't going to be in every single Justice deck, but the fact that it's a 0 cost upgrade, you can play under any player's control. If you're a Justice deck and you are going crazy at clearing side schemes, you're essentially like handing out these upgrades, so it's thinning your deck out. You're getting more cards, you know, when you shuffle up, you get the cards you want to see faster because you're thinning your deck out with all 3 copies. And also you're increasing the tempo on the board over time, because when you clear these side schemes, now 3 people get to draw a card off it, rather than just 1 person. Mission Leader is another example of a card like this, but that's a leadership card that lets everyone draw when a side scheme is defeated. just a shout out. This is probably the best example of kind of these under friendly / under kind of cheat you can do here to see kind of combos you can make in multiplayer. So now we want to move on to here. This is another kind of multiplayer tip I have for you guys. It's about calling actions. This is what I think makes multiplayer sing and what to make multiplayer feel alive in Marvel Champions. And we are in rules reference 1.7 here, but we are on the section calling action. So when you look at a card, usually it has, if it's an event, it has a sort of like triggering condition. Either it's like an interrupt, or it's a response, or it's a hero action. And action is what we're going to be talking about today. So if we look at this briefly, it says action is a triggered type of triggered ability. Players are permitted to trigger action abilities on their turn, but this is the important part, or by request during other players' turns. So outside of just this under and friendly stuff that you can do in multiplayer, this really opens up the game in a huge way. When you look at a card like Helicarrier, it has an action. It says choose a player or something like that. The next card that player controls is reduced by 1. Helicarrier isn't just for you in multiplayer, now it's for anyone at the table. Avengers Mansion is a very similar card to you. But this opens up even to crazier things like hero events. Let's say I'm like an Ironheart player and I'm in hero mode and I want to build up my kind of genius counters. I forgot what they're called for her. Well, she has kind of like the flyover and like her photon beam, whatever it's called, where like you play them and you get a counter, but if you clear the last threat off of a scheme, you get 2 counters, or if you defeat a minion, you get 2 counters, right? So in multiplayer, let's say you're Ironheart and you're going like first or second in a round, you flip up and you're like, man, I really want to get my counters rolling, I want to get them going, I have a photon beam and this flyover, but there's nothing that I can do on my own to like get these low enough, or these minions low enough, or this scheme low enough to actually get the kicker. What you can do is you can pass turn in multiplayer, call out to the table like, hey, can someone like make this minion a bit squishy, or can someone like hit this side scheme a little bit so I can get my counters rolling? And they can do that. The players after you can play their turn, they can make the side scheme go to like 3 threat, they can make the minion go to like 3 health, and then you can call actions to play the photon beam and play that flyover once your turn has been finished through the power of calling an action. So these players can only trigger action abilities on cards they control or on encounter cards. This really does open the game. Anything that is triggered, that has a trigger action on it here. So we have a hero action here, deal 4 damage to an enemy, place 1 progress counter, 2 progress if they defeated that enemy, flyover, hero action. So if you are in hero mode, because that is another important part of the condition, it has an action, hero action on it, you can call these once your turn has passed or before your turn has begun. Let's say you're going 4th in a multiplayer game and you're in hero mode, and there's like a minion and a side scheme on the table that someone wants to knock out and get some value off of, maybe off of Skilled Investigator. Just announce to the table, hey, I've got a flyover, I've got a photon beam, let me knock out that minion, or let me clear that side scheme, so that it gets you rolling, gets you building out, and gets you playing the game essentially. Another thing I want to talk about in terms of the strength of calling actions is this doesn't only apply to doing very proactive things in the game, it also applies to helping you plan out your turns. Here's another example. We're still going to use Ironheart here. So we have Tony Stark AI. It is an action, exhaust Tony Stark AI, look at the top 2 cards to your deck, add 1 to your hand and discard the other. Similarly to kind of that flyover and photon beam we were talking about, this means that while other players are taking their turns, you're just going to be like, hey, I'm calling an action to I'm just going to do like kind of my actions on my own over here, right? So while everyone is playing their turns and they're thinking out of their turns, you can do the thinking as well by calling these actions. You have your 5-card hand, and you can call this action out of turn. Maybe you find that photon beam, you find that flyover, and now your turn has changed. So you do this action early, you see all the options you have available to you, you're doing planning ahead of time so that when your turn comes around, you know, it's quick, snappy, and the game flow is good, but also you're creating like more options for yourself. Another example here is like alter ego action, right? Let's say you're going 4th on, a multiplayer turn. And let's say you're an alter ego, right? And you're going to do this alter ego action, which is exhaust Ronnie Williams, to choose either heal 2 damage or place a progress counter. And usually it's a progress counter, right? While you're going 4th on the turn, you can just call this action before your turn begins, right? You don't have to wait player 1, player 2, player 3. You start your turn, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to start and I'm going to use Ronnie Williams and I'm going to place a counter. Then I'm going to use Tony Stark AI to look at 2 cards. So you get a new card in your hand, and then you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, now I have a new card in my hand, I have new options, I didn't think about this. Being able to proactively and think about the game and call these actions before your turn really does speed up the game, and it makes it a lot more alive. I feel like when people are calling and asking to call for actions outside of their turn, the game feels really engaging, and it feels like people are engaging positively with the game. They're involved, and they want, everyone's kind of working towards that same goal. Again, this isn't only on event cards or support cards, it's also on upgrades. Again, if you're in hero mode and you're not going first, you can call this action to help. Let's say you don't actually need the progress counters anymore, right? Let's say you're version 3 and this hero action is just 3 damage. You can help squishy, make a minion more squishy in front of your aggression player, maybe, who wants to like overkill that minion or hit an Into the Fray or get rid of a guard minion for someone on the table when it is in your action. In multiplayer, the only things that are really limited to your turn are things like playing allies or playing down upgrades or like specific responses or interrupts that can't trigger without you using a basic activation. But I would say you would be surprised how many cards in the game have action printed on them and how alive the game feels once you're able to kind of do this cascade of actions that works super well in multiplayer. It feels super fun. It's super awesome. Again, I can't recommend multiplayer enough, and that is one of my advice, to just learn actions, play with them, and think about the game in the lens of that once you start getting into multiplayer. Another general piece of advice I have here that's not going to be hard to Ironheart or anything like that is to describe what your deck does when you sit down in a multiplayer game. So for example, right over here, I've got like a Wonder Man deck here. And so people might have a general idea of what Wonder Man does, right? He wants to play events and like do attacks and like flip down with his sunglasses and whatnot. He wants to do all these type of things, tuck cards and whatever. So I have Iron Man and I have Wonder Man Injustice here, right? So if you say, oh, I'm gonna play yellow, right? People are going to assume your deck is going to clear threat, and for me, that is a correct assumption, right? This deck is all about clearing threat. This is probably something I'm bringing to the con. It's super threat focused. It's side scheme focused. It's the main focus. This will keep the threat in check, or that's what it's planning to do. Now that being said, just saying your deck is in yellow doesn't actually mean you're thwarting. For example, I've played War Machine or like a Psylocke in yellow with like a upside the head and float like a butterfly card. And so that deck being in yellow, it's in yellow because it gives it more damage, not necessarily because it's thwarting. So just to clear up the confusion and to have a fun game for everyone at the table, I think it's more appropriate to describe, I want to play Wonder Man and it's all about thwarting side schemes. That's like a better example than saying, oh, I've got Justice, we don't need another Justice player, right? Or like, not necessarily like people say we don't need another Justice player, but people will assume, oh, I'm playing yellow, you're going to be thwarting. But sometimes you're like, well, I want to play War Machine, I'm playing Justice, but the whole point is to deal damage with the float like a butterfly and kind of shoulder cannon interaction. People will be like, okay, we'll probably get another Justice player then so we can handle threat in 4 players, because that is a very big distinction. If you've never played 4 player, it takes up fast if people aren't on top of it. The final thing I was going to say in this section ties back to thinking about actions and planning your turn beforehand, but it's just to think about your turn before it gets to your turn. Again, I've never played in an actual multiplayer game where this has been a problem, and nor do I think it actually is a huge problem. People come from a variety of different backgrounds, different levels of skill, different levels of kind of interaction and investment into the game. So I don't think it's our place or really anyone's place to judge a person. Let's say if their deck is slightly underperforming or their plays are making her slightly unoptimal. I have been and experienced some people who kind of make snide remarks and it's not really becoming to having a good game. I am not one of those people. That being said, it is still generally good advice to kind of plan and think about the game ahead of time before your turn, right? So it's all good to have like conversations, be engaged in the game and whatnot. That's good, and you want to do that. And I think that's in general what you should strive for when you're going for a multiplayer game or you're going to a con, that you should have a general idea of like how the deck's lines play. Some heroes are much more complex than other, like a Domino is probably going to take a longer turn, like a Captain America, for example. But in general, it's a good idea to kind of plan your turn out. If you're going first, you have no choice, right? Like you see your hand and like maybe you're looking at it during the villain phase, but usually you're engaged with that and making choices in the game. But if you're going second, third, or fourth, call those actions that like let you draw cards, or just look at your hand and think about, okay, well, I'm looking at the board, say, let me like coordinate a plan with the players at a table, right? That's a good idea, which is you don't want to play the game for people, but maybe being on the same page, being like, okay, it's a new player phase. What do we want to get done? Can someone help me with my minion? Can we knock out this side scheme? Can we hit some threat off the main? What does the amount of threat you have look like? All these questions and more get answered, and you're able to formulate plans by looking at your hand and really understanding what your options are, what you can do on a turn to effectively progress the game state. So now we're here, and now we're doing a new section to this type of video as a sequel to the video from last year. Let's talk about multiplayer pitfalls. Now, when I was new to multiplayer and trying to make decks for it, I kind of seeked out advice across the internet from different creators and whatnot, and I found some advice was definitely very helpful, and some advice was definitely questionable, especially for how I like to play the game. One piece of advice that was very popular around this time last year was putting in the max number of copies of cards that can be handed out to players. So I remember, getting kind of advice recommended to me, or seeking out advice that was like, well, let's say you're playing a protection deck, why not just throw in 3 copies of Armored Vest, right? It only costs 1 resource, and you can put them on other players on the table. And I think that piece of advice can be a trap. Unless you are coming with somebody or you're making like a theme or paired deck, this is a very big trap in my opinion. And again, I think the really big exception to this rule, I think, is if you have, the spare copies, you should probably put in 3 copies of what's it called, the Skilled Investigator that we discussed earlier, because it's just very good and it costs 0. But there's a real cost to putting 3 copies of Armored Vest in your deck, right? Okay, maybe you find it kind of early and that's really good, but do the other players at the table need the Armored Vest? If you're playing with like somebody who their basic activation is super important for them dealing damage, or super important for them to thwarting, they're never going to use the defense. There's no point in running the extra copies in your deck unless it's for you to find it earlier, if it's important for your combo or your survivability as a protection player. I think in the video last year I said something like you can run multiple or even 3 copies of Boot Camp in a deck. I would literally never do that. It just doesn't make sense to do that. The card is way too expensive. You don't know if you're going to be playing with the leadership player, and even if you are, maybe they are focused on like getting value from like go down swinging, or maybe they're focused from getting value kind of blowing up their own allies, getting a tough and healing, right? You don't know kind of like the plans of people's other decks when you're getting into a multiplayer game. So the blanket advice to include the max number of copies of these cards, because they can be played in other players, kind of falls really flat. And I think that is something that is a very common pitfall. You don't want to do this unless there is a specific reason that you can justify it for. Like, you need to have a reason to do it. And like I said, we're going back to the one that I think there is a reason. Float Like a Butterfly, maybe there is one, because your deck has a lot of money and you can give people attack output and you can guarantee confuses turns after turns. Yeah, I could see Float Like a Butterfly, right? But you need a plan for it, right? If the only goal in your deck is to play like a War Machine and he already doesn't have great economy to play multiple copies of these, just put in the 1, right? Put in the 1 for you, maybe 2 copies if you want to see it more often, but you are almost never going to be playing that on somebody else, right? It's in there for to play on you, not in there because it's like, well, maybe I have some extra resources on a turn. In general, depending on the difficulty you're playing on, you want to be spending your resources for output on the board, whether it's, thwarting a scheme or building out your own resources. Maybe you're playing an Iron Man or something, or dealing damage to a minion or the villain. And villain damage is very, very important. And I think we'll be getting into that in 1 second. I know I talked about a bit earlier about like doing duo combos with like, we can do like give someone a Boot Camp or give someone an Honorary Avenger. And I want to make sure that, to again, put a little bit of an asterisk on that if you are, planning, having some games with a certain other player, or you know how that player plays and you know this like combo works before you get onto the table, that's really good. It can be a ton of fun and you have like great moments. That being said, don't put in cards that are so outside of the realm of what your deck wants to do that you're gonna suffer for it. Like, let's say you're putting in like multiple copies of like Honorary Guardian and you're playing, I don't know, like Star-Lord Leadership, and he doesn't really need this because he makes everyone a Guardian, right? Like, don't make it to where like it clogs your decks, it clogs your hand, and it clogs your output. Go into it with a plan, test it out, and then have fun in the multiplayer game, but don't go with an untested duo plan. I think that might be a recipe for disaster. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of a multiplayer pitfall is to have a game plan. So what I mean by this is have kind of plans on what your deck does and what to do if it's not going correct. I think I talked an example about a card like Gunboat Diplomacy, or maybe something like maybe a Mutant Mayhem or something like that. These cards that kind of require, and I will actually look these up right now, that require a bit of setup, right? So you have a Gunboat Diplomacy here, which says exhaust an X-Force character and an X-Men character. Remove X among schemes and deal X damage among characters in play, where X is a combined thwart of the 2 exhausted characters. So this is like an interesting card, right? If you can like buff your thwart stat, right? Like maybe you're like a Cable with like 4 thwart because of your virus and like a heroic intuition, and you have another ally that has like, I don't know, a printed 3 thwart. Okay, we're doing 1 for 7. We're hitting 2 exhaust, 7 thwart, and 7 attack. That's pretty good. But what does your deck do if what does your deck do if you can't play this card? Let's say you see all the copies of this card early in a deck shuffle. Maybe you're not playing a vigilante training or something like that. What does your deck do otherwise besides this card? And that's kind of why I've been leaning to making toolbox decks, where I do have a combo and there are like really cute synergies, but in general the point of the deck is to progress the game forward. I do have a couple of build heroes that I'm bringing with me, but even in those build heroes, something like Adam Warlock, I have a ton of events and allies that cheat output. They're really cheap allies, but they put a minion in play. But Adam Warlock doesn't care about his HP stats, so I can take that. Or we have like a toe-to-toe, which again uses my HP as a resource because my first couple turns are going to be slower building out. How do I find value in those early turns while I'm building out on the board to make sure the game isn't lost in like 2 or 3 turns from scheme or something like that, right? I think there's really interesting decisions you can make when you're going about making decks on a lot of people will make decks with the best turn in mind, when I think you should be making decks that perform with the worst circumstances. So like, what does my deck do if I'm exhausted? Or what does my deck do if I get confused? What does my deck do if I see this key part of the combo at the bottom of my first deck shuffle? Does my deck function in this way if I don't see this one key piece, right? If the deck doesn't function at all without that piece, it might be a good idea to throw in some kind of like toolbox options for you to use in there while you're building out to this combo. Because if you put all your eggs in one basket, well, it might not be super positive for you, or maybe the other players on the table, in terms of having a good pace of play, advancing the villain and whatnot. People have different priorities. Some people want to get a ton of games, and some people like sitting and enjoying the games. I would just say in general, for the good of kind of maybe the table, you should just think about the output you're doing. And again, thinking about your deck on its worst turn, not on its best turn. Let's say you're like building a deck that does one really big, like huge thwart output. Maybe you're using something like a go all out or something. It's like I have to exhaust and I get my stats up like super, super high. And it's like, okay, I do like 10 damage, right? Like, that's really cool. Like, how long does it take you to build to that 10 damage? And are you outputting on your way there? That's a very important thing to consider. And does your deck function without the go all out? What if you have to defend to live and like it's a hard scenario that's hitting you for a ton, so you have to defend every turn? Is go all out the only way your deck does output, or is it just one part of a bigger piece of your multiplayer deck? And that's what I think the biggest kind of thing to get down to here is just having those considerations in mind. So now that we've kind of got through like our solo pitfalls, the multiplayer recommendations, and then the multiplayer pitfalls, let's talk about taking a deck from solo to multiplayer once again, like I did in last year's video, and just talk through kind of the decisions I'm making when I'm creating this deck list. So honestly, this kind of like worked out. I didn't do this on purpose thinking of Gunboat Diplomacy and Cable, but I did pick out this Cable deck that I made, for Marvel Rewind, and then I also had Gunboat Diplomacy, which like this looks like a pretty thematic hook, right? We got Cable on the card. We've got I think this is Hope Summers, I hope, or it's Rachel Summers, one of the two. Maybe it's neither of them, but let's like make something thematic with this, right? So let's say I want to bring like Justice Cable to what's it called? I want to bring Justice Cable to the convention. What does this end up looking like? So let's go in here and let's clone this deck. Let's talk about some of the concepts. We don't need a ton of allies in multiplayer because I think Cable in general, his stats are pretty solid, right? He's got 12 hit points. He can take a couple hits. He does have like a couple of like, things at the Asakani Sun, which is like after you defend, you can spend a lightning and also do some thwarting. So it's not something that's like super, super relevant for Cable. I think he'll be okay. Not having so many allies in here, but there are some certain key allies that I think are super strong, which again, you may not consider if you're playing multiplayer. It may not seem worth the cost. So I think what we're going to start with, we're going to go and do player side schemes. So we'll go with side schemes here. Let's see. So if we're looking at the ones here, I think lock and load, we probably want a good amount. I found like in general, Cable wants like 7 to 8 side seams in his deck. So we probably don't want to take out the guards. This can be really good in like solo because like, okay, it's only 4 threat. But if you think about this in multiplayer at 4 players specifically, it's a 16 threat. Probably not worth including in here. Specialized training is another one, which I think at lower player counts is really good and can feel optimal. But 20 threat is a lot to chew through, especially if we're putting it on, you know, first part of the villain phase. Evaluate threat is really fun. He can cheat this in because of his you know, his what's it called, I forget the name of his alter ego ability, his Soldier X, Soldier X ability. So this is an interesting one. I didn't include it just because I think it's a fun and unique combo, but let's say we draw into it and it's a dead card for the rest of the game, well, we can always like pivot to like the build support and whatnot. Call for backup is really strong. Established perimeter is super strong. Lock and load is also very strong, gets your gun into play. And I think that's all really fine and dandy. But another one that I think is a super underrated one, we can grab a Generation X, right? An X-Men character with +1 for thwarting it. He is X-Force though, so maybe not. I do also like something like Keep Up the Pressure because it gets people hitting damage on minions and hitting damage on the villain. And then finally, Injustice, I am also a huge fan of Lay the Trap. I think this card is super good. It does 5 damage per player to the villain. Again, Cable is super good at thwarting, so just being able to have 20 damage on demand when you're trying to push a villain or push for the game, it's super good and super, you know, efficient. I do like the 3 Energy Genius Strength and 2 Power of Justice lineup for the, for the resources. It seems pretty good to me. But for here, I'm looking at this and like, I don't think I need Professor X in this deck. Can he be kind of useful? Well, that's the thing. If we're making a Gunboat deck, right? So maybe there is a reason to put Gunboat in this, to leave Professor X in, right? Because he can be tapped out the Gunboat. So let's put this in. Let's put in like, I don't know. Let's put in like 3 copies of the Gunboat. We're at like 50 cards right now. But again, we're going to be dropping a lot of these cards. So we're going to drop to clear the areas. So let's say we're putting Gunboat in the deck, right? We want an X-Force and an X-Men. And we want to exhaust them equal to the amount of threat of the 2 combined characters. So we have Cable right now. He is our X-Force target, which is pretty good. And we have an X-Men target in Professor X here. We're taking off Nick Fury because that doesn't help with our game plan. Monica Chang doesn't help. Deadpool doesn't help. Sorry, I forgot who I took off. But yeah, Deadpool doesn't help and Daredevil doesn't help. So we're already here at phase 1, right? It's a Gunboat deck, so we probably want a couple of allies that are X-Men traded. So let's see what we have for like options here. So we can go like ally and we can do in like, is it K X-Men? Yeah. So what do we have here? This has 2 thwart to attack, but it costs 4. It's a bit expensive. Bishop here has 2 thwart, costs 3, 2 thwart, 2 thwart, 2 thwart, 2 thwart, and 2 thwart. But this one, they all cost 3. So when looking at this, there's not like a ton of huge options in terms of like a Professor X in terms of output, right? So what's something that I think we could help us advance the board state here? I'm thinking something like Marvel Girl could be pretty good because she can kind of double dip here. If she's not actually doing the Gunboat, she can remove the, you know, scheme from attacking minions. So maybe Marvel Girl's decent here. Then we can even throw in you know, Dazzler might be okay. Confused aren't super good in multiplayer, but this is kind of like off the dome, right? But then in basic, another one we probably want to grab here, which I think is really good in, is Hope Summers, not an X-Men, really? What is her trait? Hope Summers, I thought she was an X-Men. She is just X-Force. She gains the trait on your identity. Got it. So this is also another good one because she does find like superpower cards, right? So we can find the like our mind scans, we can find our telekinetic blast, and these are just like really efficient events for us. So again, Gunboat isn't an archetype I play super well, so like actually thinking about this once again, this Gunboat count as an attack event. It does count as an attack event, so Keep Up the Pressure finds it. Maybe you want to drop a couple of these. Super power training I don't think we need in this deck specifically. Build support probably more important from the Gray Malkin, and lock and load might be a bit much. So we're just trying to work with our numbers here a bit. Another thing I want to go in that's a very good thing in general for, what's it called? I find in kind of multiplayer decks in Justice is Spider-Man. You can't really justify this cost in solo, because why would I ever pay like 5, resources to clear a side scheme with 3 threat? I could usually just tap my hero and an ally to do it. But Spider-Man in multiplayer is crazy because he just clears one of Cable's side schemes completely, right? Maybe we could throw in a specialized training so Cable can get his ready, but it's even worth Cable not getting his ready just to completely clear like a build support turn 1 with like the power of justice and one of these resources and things like that. When we're looking at what the deck is trying to do, I think Depth Focus maybe doesn't find a home in this deck. I'm looking because we're really trying to get this output from Gunboat, right? Like that's kind of what we want to build up towards, and Depth Focus doesn't really help us get there. It does help us play like Forced Amnesia and stuff like that. It helps us play some of these other things, but it's probably just not good enough to include. I really love Operative Skill. I love that it's able to buff the amount of thwarting that decks get, and we have a Skilled Investigator in here for ourselves. We still want a couple more cards in here though. What is our main thwart output, and what does that thwart output look like when we're playing in 4-player? So I think in general you can probably get by in a deck like this with just triple even the odds. So we go here to event. Even the odds is one of those cards that is just almost feels required in multiplayer. You remove 1 per player threat from each side scheme, deal 1 damage to the villain for each side scheme defeated. Just 2 for 4 off of every side scheme. It's very good. You probably want max copies in almost every yellow Justice deck, unless you have really big output from like readies or something like that. So Cable can get readies here, so maybe we throw in a ready like a Justice Serve, like a one of. I do find, like I said, what does your deck look like on its worst turn? Justice Serve can give us a ready on a turn where maybe we got exhausted or something just by clearing a scheme. So that's probably pretty good. We could even maybe throw in a Vigilante Training. This is also very good. I guess we could do something with like the X-Mansion and like Mutant Education, but I think that only shuffles in identity cards, right? Only identity cards. So if we want to find the gunboats, we want a Vigilante Training so we can get better odds of finding them and shuffling them in and stuff like that. But in general, I would say a deck like this serves a purpose of, making a deck that is building towards a specific combo that maybe is not the strongest thing you can be doing on the character, but it is good enough that it's good enough that it finds output regardless. So this is kind of an example of something I would build. We got Professor X. We have some targets for the gunboats. We've got like things going on here that are like interesting and cool, and a deck like this would probably work just fine in multiplayer. I think you can also put in that one justice upgrade that like helps you with your thwarting, sense of justice. I think that's probably pretty good. It's not like super good for even the odds, but it is good because it pays for the gunboat on its own because it is a thwart event. So we have this doubles here for the power of justice. We've got these to give us some, economy. We've got a ready in here just in case. And like people are going to be like, well, you should only play 40 cards decks. You want efficient decks. But the problem is Cable really does thin his deck out quite fast. And so, it's just one of those things where you will find hands that are good, hands that play well and will get you rolling, right? First turn, you have everyone hit the build support and you're already off to the races, right? You have your what's it called? You have your Gray Malkin down that's going to, just give you money every time that a side scheme is cleared on the table. And if you don't get the Gray Malkin, let's say it's in your opening hand, then you just grab the Helicarrier and you're just spreading the love on the table. You're giving people resources, you're accelerating the game, saying you're doing what you hope to do. And while you're doing that, once you've cleared a couple of your schemes, then, hop on the table once you have maybe, I don't know, you have your Techno Virus cleared, so now you have 3 Heroic Intuition, you have 4 thwart, right? And then maybe there's a turn when you like play the Dazzler, so that's 4 + 2. So now you can do like what's it called? You can just do 6 threat and 6 threat and 6 damage, right? Now you're progressing threading, thwarting, you're hitting the main, right? But you're also progressing like dealing damage to a minion or the villain, right? This is just a quick example of like a multi-gunboat where what does my worst turn look like if I'm exhausted, right, and I can't play like the gunboat? If I'm like confused, like how do I get out of these situations? We have thwart events that aren't tied to our activations. We haven't even the odds. Maybe we even play like a multitasking in this game, in this deck. I'm not trying to make a 50 card deck here, right? But like maybe this makes it into the deck, right? Because we are playing the sense of justice here. So it does get buffed by the operative skill for like a 3 and a 3. So it's just like one of those things where he has ways to find output. What does my worst turn look like? Putting in events gets rid of makes your worst turns of getting exhausted better, and putting in kind of like these things that make your basic activation strong you know, fix, you know, other turns where you might not draw into events, right? That's kind of this toolbox mindset. Now, this isn't a perfect deck by any means. I'm not telling you to bring this 48 card pile to the Con of Heroes and then find a ton of value with it. I personally wouldn't play a Gunboat deck with Cable. I think there's better targets for it. But if you were trying to do it, trying to be thematic and make something cool and fun, you know, we have Hope Summers and we have Rachel Summers in here. We got like kind of the family stuff going on. This could be a ton of fun and definitely cool. What did you guys think about this video? Do you think I learned more or less about multiplayer deck building in kind of the year since the last video? Did you like kind of like the spiritual successor homage video? Let me know down in the comment section down below. Are you guys looking forward to any sort of deck talks for any of my Con of Hero decks? Let me know if you guys would be interested in hearing me yap about the Falcon or Tigra or Wonder Man or anything in between on that front. That's going to be it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope it was enjoyable, even for those who play solo. If you had me on in the background or whatnot, just listen to me yap. Appreciate you all the same. Take care of yourselves. Have a good one. Take it easy. Goodbye.